In the dark corners of Brooklyn's 18th Avenue, there was a man so silent, so hidden that even the FBI had trouble following him. People called him Greaseball. Others knew him as Italian Dom. But most folks didn't call him anything because they never noticed him at all. This is the true account of Domenico Cefalù, the Sicilian phantom who came from the old streets of Palermo to lead America's strongest crime family. And he accomplished it all without making a sound a night. You're going to discover the complete hidden story of the man who finished the Gotti era and returned the ancient traditions to New York's criminal underworld. But before we step into the shadows of organized crime, I want to ask, where are you watching from at this moment? Are you in New York, Sicily, or somewhere distant from the streets we're about to discover? And what time shows on your clock right now? Is it 2 o'clock in the morning as you're settling into bed? Or perhaps you're taking a long drive, searching for a story to keep your mind occupied. If you're prepared for the complete tale, every chapter, every hidden detail, every action that Domenico Cefalù took in his quiet climb to power, get comfortable, because this journey crosses 7 decades, 2 continents, and the darkest parts of organized crime in America. This story reveals power, silence, loyalty, and staying alive. This is how one man became a master of staying invisible and used that skill to control an empire. Now, let's travel back to where everything started. Palermo, Sicily, 1947, January 10th, 1947. The winter sun climbed slowly above the ancient city of Palermo, throwing long shadows over cobblestone streets that had seen thousands of years of history unfold. In a simple home somewhere in this Sicilian capital, a baby boy was born who would someday control one of the most powerful criminal groups in the world. His name was Domenico Cefalù. To grasp who Domenico Cefalù became, you must first grasp Palermo. You must grasp Sicily. You must grasp what it meant to be born into this world at this exact time in history. The Second World War had finished less than 2 years before. Italy had been destroyed. Cities were in ruins. The economy was broken. People were starving, desperate, fighting to survive. But in Sicily, there existed another power beyond the official government. There existed another system of law, another set of rules, another way of living that had been around for centuries and would last long after the war's destruction had settled. They named it Cosa Nostra, our thing. In Palermo during those years after the war, the Mafia wasn't simply a criminal group. It was a way of living, a shadow government, a system of justice and business that worked in the shadows of official society. If you needed something accomplished, you didn't approach the police. You approached certain men in certain neighborhoods. If you had an argument with someone, you didn't go to court. You went to men of respect who would settle things, who would decide, who would make their decisions stick using methods the law could never match. Young Domenico grew up breathing this atmosphere. He grew up observing, learning, understanding that 2 worlds existed: the official world that everyone could see and the real world that operated underneath it. He absorbed the most crucial lesson a Sicilian child could learn: silence. Omerta, the code of silence. It wasn't simply about refusing to talk to police. It wasn't simply about not being a snitch. Omerta was a complete way of thinking about life. It meant you solved your own problems. It meant you never displayed weakness. It meant you never, ever brought outsiders into the business of your family, your neighborhood, your world. A man who broke Omerta was worse than a criminal. He was a traitor to his entire culture, his entire way of living. In Sicily, they had an old saying, "Chi parla poco, vale assai." He who speaks little is worth a great deal. Domenico Cefalù would live by this principle more completely and perhaps any mafia boss in modern history. We understand very little about Domenico's childhood, and that's precisely how he would prefer it. There are no conversations with childhood friends, no tales about his early years, no stories about what kind of student he was, or what games he played in the streets of Palermo. This lack of information isn't by accident. It's proof of the world he came from, where personal privacy wasn't just valued, it was sacred. What we do understand is that he was born into a world where the mafia was deeply woven into every part of society. In post-war Palermo, the mafia controlled the construction business, the produce markets, the docks, the politicians. They decided who received contracts, who got jobs, who succeeded, and who suffered. And they accomplished it all through a complicated web of relationships, favors, obligations, and fear. The Sicilian mafia of this time was different from what many people picture when they think of gangsters. These weren't flashy criminals displaying their wealth. They were often silent men who dressed simply, who might own legitimate businesses, who were respected in their communities, not despite their criminal activities, but because of the order and justice they provided in a society where official institutions had failed. Young Domenico would have observed these men. Maybe he knew them. Maybe they were relatives. Family, friends, neighbors, in Palermo's close communities. Everyone knew who held real power. And in Sicilian culture, these men were often looked up to, not looked down upon. They were men of honor, men of respect, men who protected their own. The traditions Domenico absorbed in these early years would influence everything that followed. He absorbed that a man's word was more valuable than any written agreement. He absorbed that loyalty mattered more than money. He absorbed that respect had to be earned through actions, not words. He absorbed that the most powerful men were often the quietest ones, the ones you didn't notice until it was too late. He absorbed that in the world of Cosa Nostra, there existed a hierarchy as strict as any military organization. There were bosses and underbosses, captains and soldiers, associates and connected guys. There were rules about how you displayed respect, how you earned your place, how you moved up. And there were consequences for breaking these rules that were quick and harsh. Most importantly, he absorbed the basic difference between Sicilian mafiosi and the Italian-American gangsters across the ocean. The Sicilians viewed themselves as warriors of an ancient tradition. They were more disciplined, more secretive, more ready to use violence when needed. They looked down on their American cousins as soft, flashy, too eager to seek the spotlight in American ways. This cultural divide would be essential to understanding Domenico Cefalu's later climb to power. But Palermo in the late 1940s and 1950s was also a place with few opportunities. Despite the mafia's power, or perhaps because of it, Sicily stayed poor. Young men looked across the ocean to America, the land of opportunity, the land where Sicilians had already built powerful criminal empires, the land where a smart, tough, disciplined Sicilian could build his fortune, and so, like hundreds of thousands of Sicilians before him, Domenico Cefalu would eventually make the trip to America. But he wouldn't arrive as some starry-eyed immigrant seeking the American dream. He would arrive with a Sicilian education, Sicilian values, and Sicilian connections that would make him far more dangerous than the American-born gangsters could ever imagine. The exact year of Domenico Cefalu's arrival in the United States remains somewhat unclear, a fitting beginning for a man who would spend his entire life avoiding clear answers and definite records. What we understand is that he came to America in his youth, likely in the 1960s or early 1970s, part of a wave of Sicilian immigration that would deeply reshape the American Mafia. He arrived in New York City, the capital of the American underworld, home to the 5 families that controlled organized crime throughout the eastern United States. And more specifically, he settled in Brooklyn, particularly in the neighborhoods around 18th Avenue, where Sicilian immigrants had been establishing themselves for decades. For a young Sicilian immigrant arriving in New York during this time, the city must have been both familiar and completely foreign. Familiar because there were Sicilian areas everywhere, neighborhoods in Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx, where Sicilian was still the main language, where the food, the customs, the culture were brought directly from the old country. Foreign because this was America, loud and bold and fast-moving in ways that Sicily never was. Brooklyn's 18th Avenue area, where Cefalu would eventually establish his home base, was completely Sicilian. The neighborhood was filled with social clubs, where old men played cards and spoke in dialect, with bakeries that made bread the old way, with restaurants serving Sicilian dishes that hadn't changed in centuries, with small shops and businesses that operated on the old Sicilian system of favors and obligations rather than pure American capitalism. But beneath this surface of immigrant life, there was another world, a shadow world, because many of these seemingly ordinary businesses, the bakeries, the cafes, the import-export companies, the construction firms, were covers for something else. They were the operating base of what the FBI called zips. Zips was the somewhat insulting term that American-born mobsters used for Sicilian-born mafiosi. The origin of the term is debated. Some say it referred to how quickly Sicilians spoke in their dialect, the word zipping by too fast for Americans to understand. Others claim it referred to the zip of a knife or the zip of a gun. Whatever the origin, the term captured something essential. These men were different, other, more dangerous, and they were absolutely right to be cautious. The Sicilian mobsters who arrived in New York during the 1960s and 1970s were not like their American-born counterparts. They had been raised in a culture where the mafia was ancient, respected, deeply traditional. They had often been involved in serious criminal activity before ever setting foot in America. They were more violent, more disciplined, more committed to omerta. They didn't care about becoming celebrities. They didn't want their names in the papers. They wanted money and power. And they were willing to do whatever was necessary to get it. American mobsters, for all their toughness, had been softened by American life. They liked nice cars, fancy restaurants, expensive clothes. They liked being known, being recognized, being respected in public. Many of them had grown up in America where the concept of innocent until proven guilty and legal rights and due process were real things. They thought there were lines you didn't cross. The Zips had no such illusions in Sicily. The Mafia settled disputes with Lupara Bianca, white shotgun, a term for making someone disappear so completely that not even a body could be found. They dissolved bodies in acid. They fed them to pigs. They had been hardened by a culture where violence was a tool to be used efficiently and without emotion. For young Domenico Cefalù arriving in this world, the path forward would have been clear. He had the right background, Sicilian birth, the right connections, knowledge of the old ways. He would have naturally moved toward other Sicilian immigrants, toward the men who could help him establish himself in this new world while maintaining ties to the old. The timing of his arrival was also important. The late 1960s and 1970s were the golden age of the heroin trade, and Sicilian mobsters were at the center of it. The famous French connection had been broken in the early 1970s, but it was quickly replaced by what became known as the pizza connection, a massive heroin trafficking operation that used Italian pizza parlors as covers for distribution. This operation connected the Sicilian Mafia directly with American crime families, particularly the Gambinos and the Bonanos. Sicilian mobsters would arrange for morphine base to be processed into heroin in laboratories in Sicily, then smuggled to the United States, where it would be distributed through networks of pizza restaurants and other legitimate businesses. It was a brilliant scheme, and it made the Sicilian faction within American crime families incredibly wealthy and powerful. It also made them essential. The American mobsters needed the Zips because they controlled the supply chain. They had the connections in Sicily, the discipline to run international operations, the ruthlessness to eliminate problems, and this is where Domenico Cefalù enters the historical record. Not as a flashy young gangster making a name for himself, but as a quiet, reliable operator in the shadows of this vast criminal enterprise. We don't know exactly when he was formally introduced to the Gambino crime family. We don't know who vouched for him or what early jobs he performed to prove himself. But we know that by the late 1970s and early 1980s, he was operating as part of the Sicilian faction within the Gambino family, working under a captain named Pasquale Conte. Pasquale Conte was a significant figure in the Gambino family's Sicilian operations. He ran a crew that specialized in narcotics trafficking, working closely with mobsters in Sicily to import heroin. He was the kind of captain who valued the old Sicilian virtues: silence, loyalty, competence. And Domenico Cefalù possessed all three in abundance. During this period, Cefalu would have been learning the American side of the business, how the Gambino family operated, who the important players were, how to navigate the complex politics within the family, how to make money while staying under the radar of law enforcement. It was an education that would serve him well in the decades to come. But first, he would have to pass a crucial test, one that would define his reputation and set him apart from the American mobsters who would eventually become government witnesses. He would have to prove that he could keep his mouth shut no matter what. To understand what it meant to be part of the Gambino crime family in the late 1970s and early 1980s, you need to understand what the Gambino family was. It wasn't just a criminal organization. It was arguably the most powerful organized crime group in the United States, perhaps in the world. The family traced its history back to the early 20th century through legendary bosses like Carlo Gambino, who had ruled with intelligence and caution for nearly 2 decades until his death in 1976. Under Carlo Gambino, the family had expanded into every imaginable criminal enterprise: labor, racketeering, loan sharking, gambling, extortion, and increasingly narcotics trafficking. By the time Domenico Cefalù was coming up in the organization, the family was under the leadership of Paul Castellano, a sophisticated businessman type, boss who preferred white-collar crimes and looked down on the violent drug-dealing aspects of the organization. But regardless of Castellano's preferences, the drug trade was simply too profitable to ignore, and Sicilian crews like Pasquale Conte's continued to operate with significant independence. The structure of the Gambino family, like all 5 families, followed the traditional hierarchy brought over from Sicily. At the top was the boss, who held ultimate authority. Below him was the underboss, his second in command. There was also a consigliere, or counselor, who advised the boss and mediated disputes. Below these top positions were the captains or capos, each of whom controlled their own crew of soldiers and associates. To become a soldier, a made man, you had to be formally inducted in a ceremony. You had to be of Italian descent, specifically. You had to have Italian heritage on your father's side. You had to have proven yourself through criminal activities. You had to be vouched for by existing members. And most importantly, you had to have demonstrated absolute loyalty and commitment to Omerta. Being made wasn't just a promotion. It was a transformation. Once you were made, you were untouchable by non-members. You were protected by the family. But you also became a soldier in a war that never ended. With rules that were absolute, you could never cooperate with law enforcement. You could never refuse an order from a superior. You could never violate the family's interests. Breaking these rules meant death for someone like Domenico Cefalù, working his way up through Pasquale Conte's crew in the early 1980s. The path would have been clear but challenging. He would have needed to prove himself repeatedly, make money for the crew, show up when called, handle problems efficiently and quietly, never draw unnecessary attention from law enforcement, never give anyone a reason to doubt his loyalty. And based on his later reputation, we can deduce that he excelled at all of this. His Sicilian background would have been an advantage. Unlike American-born mobsters who might have grown up with other career options, with parents who wanted them to go legitimate, Cefalu came from a world where being a man of honor in Cosa Nostra was a respected path. He wasn't conflicted about the life. He wasn't doing it because he had no other options. He was doing it because it was what he knew, what he understood, what he was skilled at. The work itself during this period would have been dangerous and demanding. The heroin trade was incredibly profitable, but it also carried severe legal penalties. The federal government under President Ronald Reagan was ramping up the war on drugs. Sentences for drug trafficking were becoming harsh. The FBI was dedicating massive resources to taking down organized crime families. New laws like RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, made it possible to prosecute entire organizations rather than just individual criminals. For the Sicilian crews, this meant operating with even more caution than usual. They used code words for everything. They avoided phones whenever possible. They met in person in places that were hard to watch. They never wrote anything down. They used intermediaries to protect the higher-ups from direct involvement in criminal activities. And Domenico Cefalù, we can deduce, was perfect for this kind of work. He was naturally quiet, naturally cautious, naturally suited to a life lived in shadows. While other young gangsters might have been out at nightclubs making scenes, attracting attention, Cefalu was building relationships, making connections, earning trust. He was also learning from Pasquale Conte, a captain who understood the Sicilian way of doing things. Conte had connections that reached back to Sicily, to the mafia families there who controlled the heroin supply. He understood the importance of maintaining these relationships, of keeping the supply lines open, of balancing loyalty to the American family with respect for the Sicilian traditions. In many ways, Conte was preparing a new generation of Sicilian-American mobsters who could bridge both worlds. Men who understood American business and law enforcement tactics, but who also maintained the old Sicilian values of omerta and loyalty. Men who could operate in America, but who would never lose touch with their roots. Domenico Cefalù was exactly this kind of man. And soon he would face his first major test, a test that would define his reputation and demonstrate exactly what kind of mobster he was. He was about to be arrested, prosecuted, and convicted, and the whole world would get to see how a real Sicilian man of honor handles hardship. February 27, 1982. It was a date that would mark the beginning of Domenico Cefalu's transformation from anonymous soldier to legendary figure within organized crime circles. Federal agents, acting on months of surveillance and investigation, swept through New York, executing arrests in a major narcotics case. Among those taken into custody was Domenico Cefalù, now 34 years old, along with 10 other individuals, including his uncle and his cousin. The charges were severe: conspiracy to import heroin and violating bank secrecy laws. The operation had focused on a Sicilian heroin trafficking network that was bringing massive quantities of the drug into the United States. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of kilograms worth millions of dollars on the street. The network stretched from Sicily to New York, using the kinds of sophisticated smuggling techniques that would later become famous in the Pizza Connection case. For Cefalu, this arrest was a disaster in the short term, but would prove to be the making of his reputation in the long term, because what happened next would define him in the eyes of everyone who mattered in the underworld. The federal government, armed with evidence for wiretaps, surveillance, and potentially cooperating witnesses, had a strong case. They offered deals. They pressed hard on defendants to cooperate, to provide information about the larger organization, to help them move up the chain to bigger targets. This was standard practice. Start with the soldiers and work your way up to the bosses. In the American criminal justice system, cooperation could mean the difference between spending decades in prison and walking free in a few years. The government had enormous power to reduce sentences for defendants who provided substantial assistance. And by the 1980s, more and more mobsters were taking these deals. The old code of omerta was starting to crack under the pressure of long federal sentences, but not for Domenico Cefalù, not for his Sicilian uncle, not for his Sicilian cousin. They said nothing. They gave up no one. They made no deals. In March 1982, after a trial in which Cefalu and his co-defendants maintained their silence, refusing to testify or cooperate in any way, they were convicted. Domenico Cefalù was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. 8 years, almost a decade of his life gone. He was 35 years old, in what should have been the prime of his criminal career. And yet, sources would later indicate that Cefalu faced this sentence without complaint, without regret, without even considering cooperation. In the world of La Cosa Nostra, this was everything. This was the entire test of a man's character. Anyone can be a gangster when things are going well, when the money is flowing, when the parties are happening. But when you're facing a decade in prison, when federal prosecutors are offering you a way out in exchange for just giving them some names, some details, some help building their case, that's when you find out who's really a man of honor and who's just playing a role. Domenico Cefalù proved he was the real thing. He reported to federal prison, likely one of the facilities that held organized crime defendants, places like Fort Dix or Allenwood or Lewisburg, and he began serving his time the way a made man was supposed to serve time, with dignity, with discipline, with honor. Doing time in federal prison as a member of La Cosa Nostra was a unique experience. You weren't just another inmate. You were part of a structure, a hierarchy that continued even behind bars. Made men looked out for each other. They controlled certain aspects of prison life. They maintained their dignity and their code. For Cefalu, this period would have been an opportunity to build relationships with other imprisoned mobsters. These weren't just social connections. They were professional networking opportunities. In prison, you might share a unit with made men from all the 5 families, with bosses and captains and legendary figures who commanded enormous respect. If you conducted yourself properly, if you showed the right kind of character, you could earn respect that would serve you well once you were released. And Cefalu, quiet and observant as always, would have made the most of this time. He would have watched, learned, understood who held real power, who was respected, who had the connections that mattered, he would have demonstrated his commitment to the code, his unwillingness to break even under the most difficult circumstances. There's a concept in prison culture, both in the regular inmate population and especially in the mafia subculture. Standing up. It means taking your sentence like a man, not complaining, not cooperating, not looking for shortcuts or special treatment, just doing your time with dignity. Domenico Cefalù stood up for 6 years. He was released 2 years early for good behavior. He stood up, and word of this would have spread throughout the organized crime world. Here was a Sicilian who embodied the old values. Here was a man who chose 6 years in a cage over 5 minutes of cooperation. Here was someone who could be trusted absolutely. In 1987, at age 40, Domenico Cefalù walked out of federal prison and back onto the streets of Brooklyn. He was older, grayer, harder, but he was also more respected than ever. He had passed the first great test. He had proven himself to be exactly the kind of man the Gambino family needed. But his troubles with the law were far from over. In fact, his next legal battle would be even more legendary, cementing his reputation as perhaps the most committed soldier in the modern American Mafia. When Domenico Cefalù returned to the streets of Brooklyn in 1987, he came back to a very different Gambino family than the one he'd left. In the years of his imprisonment, seismic changes had shaken the organization to its core. Most dramatically, Paul Castellano, the boss who had led the family during Cefalu's arrest, was dead, murdered in December 1985 in front of Sparks' Steak House in Manhattan in one of the most brazen mob hits in New York history. His killer, or rather the man who orchestrated his killing, was John Gotti, a captain in the family who had grown tired of Castellano's leadership and decided to take power by force. John Gotti was everything that Domenico Cefalù was not. Where Cefalu was invisible, Gotti was flamboyant. Where Cefalu avoided attention, Gotti courted it. Where Cefalu dressed modestly and moved through life like a ghost, Gotti wore $2,000 suits and held court at the Ravenite Social Club like a celebrity. Gotti had grown up in the rough neighborhoods of Queens and Brooklyn, a street tough who had risen through the ranks of the Gambino family through a combination of violence, charisma, and strategic cunning. After orchestrating Castellano's murder, he had taken control of the family and quickly become the most famous gangster in America. Perhaps the most famous gangster since Al Capone. The media loved him. They called him the Dapper Don because of his expensive clothes. They called him the Teflon Don because charges against him seemed to never stick. He beat 3 major prosecutions in the late 1980s, leading to acquittals that he celebrated publicly, reinforcing his image as untouchable. But within the family, and especially among the Sicilian faction, there were deep concerns about Gotti's style. The old-timers, the men who remembered how Carlo Gambino had ruled by being invisible, who understood that the secret to longevity in organized crime was to avoid the spotlight, were horrified by Gotti's behavior. Domenico Cefalù, fresh out of prison and back on the streets, would have observed all of this with his characteristic silence. He wasn't in a position to criticize the boss. That would be a death sentence. But he could see what others saw, that Gotti's love of publicity was bringing enormous law enforcement scrutiny to the family. The FBI had made taking down Gotti a top priority. They were throwing unlimited resources at the problem. But there was also opportunity in this chaos. Gotti, for all his flaws, recognized talent and loyalty. And a man returning from prison with 6 years served and not a single word of cooperation, that was the kind of man Gotti could respect, even admire. Cefalu went back to work with Pasquale Conte's crew, picking up where he'd left off. He was older now, more seasoned, carrying the credibility that came from having done serious time without breaking. This wasn't just respect. This was reverence. In a world where more and more mobsters were cutting deals and entering witness protection, here was a throwback to the old ways. And then sometime in 1990 or 1991, the exact date is not public record, and that's fitting for a man like Cefalu. He received the ultimate recognition. He was formally inducted as a made man in the Gambino crime family, with John Gotti himself presiding over the ceremony. The making ceremony in La Cosa Nostra is a ritual that has remained largely unchanged since the organization's earliest days in Sicily. It's held in secret, usually in the basement of a social club or a private home. Only made members can be present. The inductee is brought in, usually not knowing exactly what's about to happen. The boss explains what it means to be a member of this family. He talks about the rules. You never reveal the existence of this thing of ours to anyone outside. You never cooperate with law enforcement. You never violate another member's wife. You always obey orders from your superiors. You put the family before everything, before your own family, before your own life, before everything. Then comes the ritual itself. The inductee's trigger finger is pricked with a pin until it bleeds. The blood is smeared on a holy card, usually depicting a saint. The card is set on fire, and the inductee holds the burning card in his cupped hands while reciting an oath. May I burn like this saint if I betray the oath of La Cosa Nostra. After this, the new member kisses the boss and all the other made men present on the cheek. The kiss of brotherhood, signifying that they are now all equals in the family, all bound by the same oath, all subject to the same rules. For Domenico Cefalù, at age 43 or 44, this ceremony would have been the culmination of years of work, of proving himself, of demonstrating his value to the organization. He was now a made man, a full member of La Cosa Nostra, protected by the family, but also forever bound to its rules. And make no mistake, being made was not just an honor. It was also a death sentence of sorts, because once you were made, you could never leave, you could never retire. You were a soldier until the day you died, whether that death came from old age, from law enforcement, or from a bullet from your own people for some violation of the rules. But for men like Cefalu, raised in the Sicilian tradition, this wasn't a burden. It was an identity. This was who he was. This was what he was born to do. During this period, working as a made man under John Gotti's leadership, Cefalu would have continued his quiet, effective work. He was associated with various rackets, traditional mafia activities like extortion, loan sharking, labor racketeering, but he did it all with a low profile, never drawing attention, never making waves. This was in stark contrast to Gotti's increasingly public presence. The boss was constantly in the news. He held meetings at the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, where FBI surveillance was constant and obvious. He seemed to believe he was invincible, that his acquittals had made him untouchable. But the FBI was building a case. They had placed bugs in the Ravenite. They had agents following Gotti everywhere. They were documenting his meetings, his orders, his entire operation, and perhaps most dangerously, they were working on his underboss, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, who was starting to realize that Gotti's ego was going to bring them all down. Cefalu, operating in his quiet corner of the Gambino empire, would have watched all of this with growing concern. He had seen what happened when bosses attracted too much attention. He had learned in Sicily and in the Sicilian faction of the American Mafia that the most, Successful criminals were the ones nobody knew about. But he kept these thoughts to himself. He continued to work. He continued to make money for his captain and his family. He continued to honor the oath he had taken. And he was about to face his second great test, one that would elevate his reputation even further and demonstrate just how committed he was to the code of silence. In 1992, just a year or so after Domenico Cefalù had been made, his captain, Pasquale Conte, became the target of a federal investigation. The government was building a case against Conte and his crew, trying to document their criminal activities and gather evidence for a prosecution. As part of this investigation, the government used a tool that had become increasingly common in organized crime cases, the grand jury. A grand jury is a group of citizens empowered to investigate potential criminal conduct and determine whether criminal charges should be brought. Unlike a trial jury, a grand jury operates in secret, and witnesses can be compelled to testify under threat of contempt charges. For prosecutors going after the mafia, grand juries were incredibly useful. They could subpoena mobsters and ask them questions under oath. If the mobsters refused to answer, they could be held in contempt and jailed. If they lied, they could be prosecuted for perjury. And if they told the truth, they might provide evidence that could be used against their superiors. It was a trap with no good exits, except for one. You could answer a few basic questions to show you were attempting to comply, and then refuse to answer any meaningful questions about criminal activity. You would go to jail for contempt. But it would be civil contempt, not criminal. You'd be held until you agreed to testify, or until the grand jury's term expired. It was prison time, but it wasn't a criminal conviction, and it allowed you to maintain your reputation as someone who wouldn't cooperate. This is exactly what Domenico Cefalù did in 1992. He was summoned to appear before a grand jury investigating Pasquale Conte. He showed up. He had to. He answered a few preliminary questions. His name, his address, basic biographical information. And then when the questions turned to matters of substance, to questions about Conte and his activities, Cefalu refused to answer. "I refuse to answer on the grounds that it might incriminate me," he would have said, invoking his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. But there was a problem with that strategy. The prosecutors could offer him immunity, which meant that nothing he said could be used against him personally. And if he had immunity, he couldn't claim the Fifth Amendment anymore. He would have to either answer or explicitly refuse to answer despite immunity. Cefalu chose to refuse. The judge held him in civil contempt and sentenced him to 18 months in jail. 18 months behind bars for the crime of not answering questions about his captain. Domenico Cefalù reported to jail without complaint. He did his 18 months the same way he'd done his previous sentence, with dignity, with silence, with honor. He never wavered. He never reconsidered. He never suggested that maybe it would be easier to just answer a few questions. And then on February 23, 1993, something happened that would test him even further. He was summoned again, this time to testify at Pasquale Conte's actual trial. The grand jury phase was over. Now there was a trial happening, and the government wanted Cefalu as a witness. Once again, he refused to testify. An 18-month contempt sentence for refusing to talk to a grand jury was one thing, but refusing to testify at a trial was a different level of defiance. The government was furious. They wanted to make an example of him, but they couldn't hold him in civil contempt indefinitely. So they did something unusual. They waited. They let him finish his civil contempt sentence, and on February 6, 1994, the day he was released from jail after 18 months, they were waiting for him. he walked out of the jail a free man. For perhaps a few hours, he breathed free air. And then he was arrested again, this time on criminal contempt charges. Criminal contempt was different. This wasn't just being held until you agreed to testify. This was a criminal charge that would result in a conviction and a separate sentence. It was the government saying, "We're not just going to hold you until you cooperate. We're going to punish you for refusing to cooperate." The case wound through the courts for 2 years. Finally, in 1996, Domenico Cefalù was convicted of criminal contempt and sentenced to 33 months in federal prison. Let's pause and add this up. 18 months for civil contempt. 33 months for criminal contempt. That's 51 months. That's more than 4 years in prison for the crime of refusing to answer questions about his captain. 4 years, not for committing a crime, though obviously he was involved in criminal activities, but 4 years specifically for staying silent. 4 years for honoring Omerta. 4 years for being exactly what a made man in La Cosa Nostra was supposed to be. And through all of this, through every court appearance, every sentencing, every day in a cell, Domenico Cefalù never broke. He never wavered. He never suggested that maybe this wasn't worth it, that maybe he should just answer a few questions and get on with his life. This is what separates Domenico Cefalù from almost every other modern mobster. It's easy to say you believe in the code when you're free and making money. It's easy to talk tough when you're sitting in a social club with your friends. But when you're facing years in prison for doing nothing more than keeping your mouth shut, when the government is offering you a way out, when they're telling you that you could walk free tomorrow if you just cooperate, that's when you find out what you're really made of. Cefalu showed the world what he was made of. He was made of Sicilian stone. He was made of old world honor. He was made of something that was becoming increasingly rare in the American Mafia. Absolute, unshakable loyalty to the code. Word of this spread through the underworld like wildfire. Stories were told about the Sicilian guy who would rather rot in prison than say a single word about his captain. About the made man who lived the code so completely that he made everyone else look like pretenders. While John Gotti and his flashy American-born associates were all over the news, while the Teflon Don was heading toward his inevitable downfall, Domenico Cefalù was quietly building a reputation that would eventually carry him to the very top of the organization. Because in a world where cooperators were becoming more and more common, where even made men were cutting deals and entering witness protection, where the code of Omerta was being violated left and right, here was a man who embodied the old ways. Here was a man who could be trusted absolutely. Here was a man who would never, ever break, and in the years to come, as the Gambino family faced crisis after crisis, as boss after boss fell to prosecution or cooperation, the family would eventually turn to men like Domenico Cefalù to save them, because only a ghost could survive in the world that was coming. Only someone who lived in complete silence and invisibility could lead the family through the surveillance state that law enforcement was building. Only someone like Domenico Cefalù could be the boss of the future. While Domenico Cefalù was serving his contempt sentences in the mid-1990s, staying silent and building his legendary reputation, the Gambino crime family was being torn apart at its highest levels. The beginning of the end came in 1991, just a few years after Cefalu had been made. The FBI, after years of intensive surveillance, finally had what they needed to take down John Gotti. They had placed bugs in the Ravenite Social Club and in an apartment above the club where Gotti held his most sensitive meetings. On these tapes, they had captured Gotti discussing murders, ordering hits, running the family's criminal operations. But even more devastating than the tapes was what happened with Salvatore Gravano, Gotti's underboss and right-hand man. Gravano, known as Sammy the Bull, had been with Gotti for years. He had participated in the Castellano murder. He had helped Gotti run the family. He was a tough, feared mobster who had been involved in 19 murders, and he decided to cooperate. In the history of the American Mafia, there had never been a cooperation quite like this. Underbosses didn't flip. Made men of Gravano's stature and involvement didn't testify. The underboss of the Gambino crime family testifying in open court against his boss? It was unprecedented. It was unthinkable. It was the ultimate violation of omerta. But Gravano had calculated that Gotti's ego and recklessness were going to bring them both down anyway. On the surveillance tapes, Gotti had been caught criticizing Gravano, insulting him, questioning his decisions. Gravano saw the writing on the wall. He was going down for life unless he cooperated. So he did. He told the government everything. Every murder, every racket, every aspect of how the Gambino family operated. And most importantly, he agreed to testify against John Gotti. The trial was a media circus. Gotti, always the showman, played to the cameras. But inside the courtroom, Sammy Gravano was methodically describing Gotti's involvement in murders and racketeering. The jury heard tape after tape of Gotti's voice discussing crimes, giving orders, running the family. On April 2nd, 1992, John Gotti was convicted on all counts. 5 murders, conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, illegal gambling, extortion, obstruction of justice, tax evasion. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Dapper Don, the Teflon Don, the most famous gangster in America, was done. He would die in prison in 2002, never having seen freedom again after his conviction. For the Gambino family, this was a catastrophe. But it was also, in a strange way, expected. The old-timers, the Sicilian faction, the men who understood the old ways, they had all seen this coming. Gotti's love of publicity, his need to be seen and recognized, his refusal to operate in the shadows. It had been a death sentence from the beginning. But the problems for the Gambino family were just beginning, because after Gotti's conviction, the leadership of the family fell to his son, John A. Gotti, known as Junior. Junior Gotti was not his father. He had grown up privileged, the son of a powerful gangster. He had been pushed into the life more than he had chosen it, and he was nowhere near as capable as his father, for all of his father's faults. Junior became acting boss after his father's conviction, trying to hold the family together, but he was in over his head. The FBI was all over the Gambino family. They were using new surveillance techniques, new informants, new legal strategies, and more members were deciding that cooperation was better than life in prison. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Gambino family was being hit with indictment after indictment. Junior Gotti himself was prosecuted multiple times. His trials ended in mistrials. The juries couldn't unanimously agree to convict him, but he was clearly not effective as a leader while constantly fighting criminal charges. In 2004, after his third mistrial, Junior Gotti announced that he was done with the life. He claimed he had left the Gambino family. Whether this was true or just a legal strategy, it effectively meant that the Gotti dynasty that had ruled the family since 1985 was over. But who would replace them? The family needed leadership. They needed someone who could hold the organization together, who could command respect, who could navigate the treacherous waters of modern law enforcement scrutiny. The family turned to a series of acting bosses and ruling panels. Peter Gotti, John's brother, took over as official boss around 2002. But in June 2002, he was indicted on racketeering charges, among others, across 2 separate indictments. He was convicted in his first trial, in March 2003, received a 9-year sentence in April 2004, was convicted in a second trial in December 2004, and was eventually sentenced to a cumulative 25 years in prison in July 2005. The Gambino family, once the most powerful and well-organized crime family in America, was in chaos. Bosses were falling one after another. Cooperators were everywhere. The FBI had penetrated the organization at multiple levels. Traditional Italian-American mobsters, the kinds of guys who had grown up in New York, who had American attitudes, who maybe weren't as committed to the old ways, were flipping left and right. The family needed something different. They needed someone from the old school, someone who understood omerta not as a suggestion, but as a fundamental principle of life, someone who had proven again and again that they would never cooperate, never break, never betray the family. They needed someone like Domenico Cefalù. By the mid-2000s, after decades of watching from the shadows, the Sicilian faction within the Gambino family saw their opportunity. The American-born leadership had failed. The Gotti era had been a disaster. The flashy, publicity-seeking style of modern American gangsters had brought the family to its knees. It was time for the Sicilians to take control. It was time to go back to the old ways. It was time for someone who understood that real power comes from invisibility, not celebrity. In 2005, in the midst of the family's leadership crisis, Domenico Cefalù was elevated to the position of underboss. The man who had named him to this position was Jackie D'Amico, who was serving as acting boss at the time. Being named underboss was a huge promotion for Cefalu, who was now 58 years old. It put him in the second highest position in the family hierarchy. But more importantly, his primary responsibility was to oversee the Sicilian faction, the Zips, the old-school mobsters who had maintained their discipline and their commitment to omerta, even as the American wing of the family crumbled. This was perfect for Cefalu. The Sicilian faction was where he had come from, where he had built his reputation, where his natural tendencies toward silence and invisibility were not just accepted, but celebrated. These were men who understood that the best gangster is one that nobody knows about. They understood that you don't talk on phones, you don't hold meetings in public, you don't attract attention, you don't become a celebrity. During this period, Cefalu would have been consolidating power, building relationships, positioning himself for an eventual move to the top. He was the underboss, but everyone knew that the real power in the family was shifting toward the Sicilian faction. The American-born members had shown themselves to be unreliable, willing to cooperate when faced with long sentences. But the Sicilians, they still lived by the code. At the same time, another Sicilian was rising through the ranks, Francesco Frank Colli. Colli was younger than Cefalu. Born in 1965, he was 18 years younger, but he shared many of Cefalu's qualities. He was Sicilian-born, deeply connected to the mafia families in Sicily. Committed to the old ways, he was also sophisticated, intelligent, capable of operating in both the American and Sicilian worlds. Colli had been made in the 1990s and had quickly established himself as a significant figure in the family. He was involved in various rackets, but always operated carefully, always stayed out of the spotlight. He had strong connections to the Inzerillo family in Sicily, one of the most powerful mafia clans. These connections made him invaluable to the Gambino family because they allowed for continued cooperation with Sicilian criminal organizations. Cefalu and Colli would have worked closely together during this period. They represented the future of the Gambino family, a return to Sicilian values, to omerta, to operating in the shadows rather than in front of cameras. But before they could fully implement their vision, the family would face another major crisis, one that would test Cefalu again and prove once more that he was exactly the kind of leader they needed. February 7th, 2008. It was before dawn when FBI agents and Italian police officers began executing arrests simultaneously in the United States and Sicily. It was one of the largest coordinated anti-mafia operations in history, targeting the deep connections between the Sicilian Mafia and the American Gambino family. They called it Operation Old Bridge, referring to the ancient connections between Sicilian organized crime and its American offshoot. The investigation had taken years and involved unprecedented cooperation between American and Italian law enforcement agencies. When the arrests were complete, over 60 mobsters were in custody on both sides of the Atlantic, and among those arrested in New York was Domenico Cefalù, now 61 years old and serving as the Gambino family's underboss. The indictment against Cefalu and his co-defendants was extensive. The charges included racketeering, conspiracy, extortion, and various other crimes related to the family's control over the trucking industry and construction projects. The government had evidence of the Gambino family's systematic extortion of businesses, their infiltration of labor unions, their continued connection to criminal organizations in Sicily. Also arrested were Frank Colli and several other prominent members of the Sicilian faction, including Johnny Nichols, who had extensive connections in Sicily and was considered one of the primary links between the two countries' criminal organizations. The evidence against them was substantial. The FBI had conducted extensive surveillance, had cooperating witnesses, had documentation of extortion payments and corrupt business practices. It was a strong case that could have resulted in decades in prison if it went to trial. For many defendants, this would be the moment when cooperation starts to look attractive. The government would be offering deals, trying to flip lower-level defendants against the higher-ups. They would be showing evidence, making it clear that conviction at trial was likely. They would be talking about sentences of 15, 20, 25 years. But Domenico Cefalù had been through this before. He knew the game. He knew the pressure that would be applied. He knew that the government would try everything to get him to cooperate. And he knew with absolute certainty that he never would. In 2009, after months of negotiations, Cefalu accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to extortion charges. The government recommended a sentence of 3 years. The judge, in consideration of his age and other factors, sentenced him to 2 years in federal prison. 2 years at age 62. It was a manageable sentence. He could do 2 years standing on his head. But more importantly, the plea agreement contained no cooperation requirement. He gave up no names. He provided no evidence against anyone else. He told the government nothing that they didn't already know from other sources. Once again, Domenico Cefalù had faced federal prosecution, faced years in prison, and had refused to cooperate. Once again, he had proven that he was a man of honor in the truest sense of that term. Once again, he had demonstrated absolute commitment to Omerta. He reported to federal prison in 2009 and began serving his sentence. And as he did his time, things were happening on the outside. The Gambino family was struggling. Multiple leaders had been arrested in Operation Old Bridge. The American faction was in disarray. Cooperators were everywhere. The family needed a leader, not an acting boss or a temporary solution. They needed someone who could truly command the organization, who had the respect of all factions, who had proven themselves beyond any doubt. They needed someone who had served multiple prison sentences without ever saying a word, someone who had been tested again and again and had never broken, someone who embodied the old Sicilian values that had sustained La Cosa Nostra for over a century. On November 3, 2009, Domenico Cefalù was released from federal prison. He was 62 years old. He had been in and out of prison for decades. He had sacrificed years of his life to honor the code, and now, finally, his moment had come. The Gambino family was about to put a Sicilian ghost at the very top of their organization. The quiet man from 18th Avenue, a man who had spent his entire life in the shadows, was about to become the most powerful gangster in New York. But you would never know it by looking at him, because that was exactly the way Domenico Cefalù wanted it. July 2011, in a secret ceremony somewhere in New York, perhaps in the basement of a social club in Brooklyn, perhaps in a private home, perhaps in a location that law enforcement would never discover, the leadership of the Gambino crime family made it official. Domenico Cefalù was formally recognized as the boss of the family. At age 64, Italian Dom had reached the pinnacle of organized crime in America. He was now the head of one of the 5 families that controlled criminal activities throughout the eastern United States. He commanded hundreds of made men and thousands of associates. He had influence over labor unions, construction companies, waste management, gambling operations, loan sharking, and numerous other criminal enterprises worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But you would never have known by looking at him. There were no press conferences, no fancy suits and photo opportunities, no holding court at famous restaurants, no celebrity lifestyle. Domenico Cefalù became boss the way he had lived his entire life, in absolute silence and invisibility. The symbolism of his ascension was profound. For the first time since the family's founding, a Sicilian-born member was in charge, not a second-generation Italian-American, not someone who had grown up in Brooklyn or Queens, speaking English and absorbing American culture. A man born in Palermo, raised in the Sicilian tradition, who still embodied the ancient code of Cosa Nostra. It was the end of over 25 years of Gotti family control. It was a complete rejection of everything John Gotti had represented. Where Gotti had been flashy, Cefalu was invisible. Where Gotti had courted publicity, Cefalu avoided it like poison. Where Gotti had worn expensive suits and held meetings in public places, Cefalu dressed modestly and met people where no one could see. The law enforcement community confirmed the transition. FBI reports began listing Domenico Cefalù as the official boss of the Gambino family. But they had almost nothing on him, no recent arrests, no significant surveillance footage, no informants close enough to provide real intelligence. He was a ghost, the perfect boss for the surveillance age. Along with naming Cefalu as boss, the family made another crucial appointment. Frank Colli was named underboss. At 46, Colli was significantly younger than Cefalu, but he shared the same Sicilian values, the same commitment to the old ways, the same understanding that real power comes from operating in shadows together. Cefalu and Colli represented a complete transformation of the Gambino family's leadership philosophy. They were going back to basics, back to the methods that had allowed Carlo Gambino to rule for nearly 20 years, without ever being seriously threatened by law enforcement. They were embracing invisibility as a strategy. The code names that law enforcement used for Cefalu told you everything you needed to know about him. Greaseball, a derogatory term the FBI used. Italian Dom, Dom from 18th Avenue. Even his street name wasn't particularly creative or memorable. He was just Dom, the guy from 18th Avenue. Nothing special, nothing notable. Just another old Italian guy in Brooklyn. Except he was now one of the most powerful criminals in America. From 2011 to 2015, Domenico Cefalù ruled the Gambino crime family with an iron fist wrapped in complete invisibility. These years would prove to be remarkably quiet. at least as far as public knowledge was concerned. And that was exactly the point under Cefalu's leadership. The family returned to fundamentals. No more publicity stunts, no more celebrity gangsters, no more meetings in public places where the FBI could easily surveil them. Instead, the family operated the way Sicilian organized crime had operated for centuries, in complete secrecy, with absolute discipline, using methods that made surveillance and prosecution extremely difficult. The structure of the family during this period reflected Cefalu's values. He surrounded himself with Sicilian-born mobsters, or those who had been raised in the Sicilian tradition. These were men who understood omerta, not as an abstract concept, but as a fundamental way of life. Men who would rather die than cooperate, men who knew how to operate in the shadows. Frank Colli, as underboss, was Cefalu's right hand. Colli handled much of the day-to-day operations, meeting with captains, resolving disputes, overseeing the family's various criminal enterprises. But he did so carefully, always avoiding attention, always staying out of law enforcement's crosshairs. The family's criminal activities during this period continued along traditional lines. Labor racketeering remained a core business. The Gambinos maintained their influence over certain unions, particularly in construction and waste management. This allowed them to skim money from legitimate projects, enforce no-show jobs for family members, and control which companies got work. Extortion and protection rackets continued. Businesses in certain neighborhoods still paid regular tribute to the family in exchange for protection. Protection that often meant nothing more than being left alone by the people you were paying. But the amounts were smaller than in previous eras. The operations more discreet. Gambling operations persisted, though they had evolved with technology. Sports betting, illegal card games, bookmaking, all still profitable, all still controlled by the family. But gone were the days of obvious gambling operations in social clubs. Everything was smaller, more mobile, harder to track. Loan sharking remained lucrative, the family had capital, and there were always people who needed money and couldn't get it through legitimate channels, either because of bad credit or because they needed it for illegal purposes. The interest rates were usurious, often 2 to 3% per week, and the collection methods were brutal, but it was profitable and relatively low risk compared to more visible crimes. The key to all of this was how it was run under Cefalu. The family operated with multiple layers of protection. The boss didn't directly order crimes. He expressed his desires and expectations, and his underlings figured out how to make it happen. Money flowed up the chain through intermediaries and buffers, making it nearly impossible to directly connect the leadership to specific crimes. Meetings were held in person, never over phones. Important discussions happened during walks on busy streets where surveillance was difficult, or in cars that were swept for bugs, or in locations that changed constantly. The family became paranoid about electronic surveillance, and rightly so. The FBI had become incredibly sophisticated at using technology to penetrate criminal organizations. Perhaps most importantly, Cefalu continued the practice of vetting potential members and associates carefully. The family had been burned badly by cooperators during the Gotti era. Under Cefalu, new members had to prove themselves over years, had to demonstrate absolute loyalty, had to show that they understood and lived by the code. The emphasis was on quality over quantity. Better to have 50 reliable soldiers than 200 men who might flip the first time they faced a serious prison sentence. And it worked from 2011 to 2015. During Cefalu's official reign as boss, there were no major prosecutions of the family's leadership, no successful FBI operations that penetrated the top levels. No cooperating witnesses from the inner circle. The Gambino family, under Cefalu's invisible leadership, enjoyed one of the longest periods of stability in its recent history. Compare this to the Gotti years, when it seemed like someone was getting arrested every few months, when cooperators were everywhere, when the family was constantly in crisis. Or compare it to other crime families during the same period. The Colombos were engaged in internal warfare. The Lucchese's were being prosecuted left and right. The Bonanos were still recovering from the Donnie Brasco infiltration in the leadership of Joe Massino, who himself had become a cooperator. The Gambino family, under their ghost boss, was thriving, or at least surviving, which in the modern era of organized crime was as good as thriving. But Cefalu was also getting older. By 2015, he was 68 years old. He had been in the life for over 4 decades. He had spent years in prison. He had the stress of running a major criminal organization in an era when law enforcement had nearly unlimited resources and sophisticated technology. At some point, every boss faces a question: when to step down, when to pass the torch, when to retire before age or law enforcement catches up with you. For Domenico Cefalù, that moment appeared to come in 2015. In 2015, reports began to emerge from law enforcement sources that there had been a change in the Gambino family's leadership. According to these reports, Frank Colli had been elevated from underboss to acting boss, taking over the day-to-day operations of the family. Did this mean Cefalu had stepped down? Had he retired? Was he still the official boss, but just stepping back from active management? The truth, as with everything involving Domenico Cefalù, was shrouded in mystery. Some law enforcement analysts believe that Cefalu had made a strategic decision to retire while he was ahead. At 68, after 4 years of running the family without any major legal problems, he had accomplished something remarkable. He had ruled one of the 5 families and walked away free. Unindicted, with his reputation intact, very few mafia bosses could make that claim. The logic of retirement made sense. Cefalu had spent enough time in prison. He had proven everything he needed to prove. He had enough money to live comfortably. Why not step back? Let a younger man handle the stress and risk of leadership and enjoy his remaining years in quiet peace? Frank Colli was the perfect successor. At 50, he was young enough to lead for many years, but old enough to command respect. He had proven himself over decades in the organization. He shared Cefalu's Sicilian values and his commitment to operating in the shadows. He had deep connections to Sicily that would allow the family to maintain its international relationships. And he had learned directly from Cefalu how to run a modern mafia family in an age of surveillance and cooperators. But there was another theory, one that better fit with everything we knew about Domenico Cefalù and his understanding of power. Perhaps he hadn't really retired at all. Perhaps he remained the true boss, the one making the ultimate decisions, while allowing Colli to be the public face of the leadership. Perhaps this was just another layer of protection, another way of staying in the shadows while maintaining control in the mafia. There's often a difference between the official boss and the real power. Sometimes a boss will elevate someone to acting boss or street boss while remaining the true authority behind the scenes. This allows the real boss to avoid surveillance and prosecution while still controlling the organization. It's a buffer, a layer of protection. Given Cefalu's legendary commitment to invisibility, it wouldn't be surprising if this was his strategy. Let Colli handle the meetings, the disputes, the day-to-day issues that might attract law enforcement attention. Meanwhile, the real boss remains completely invisible, making the important strategic decisions from a position of total safety. The FBI seemed confused about the situation. Some reports listed Kali as the acting boss. Others continued to list Cefalu as the official boss. This ambiguity was probably exactly what Cefalu wanted. Nobody knew for sure who was really in charge, which made it harder to target anyone for prosecution. What we do know is that from 2015 onward, Frank Kali became more visible in the leadership role. Not highly visible, he still operated carefully, maintaining the low profile that Cefalu had established as the standard for the family. But more visible than Cefalu, who essentially disappeared from law enforcement radar entirely, Cefalu retreated to his Brooklyn neighborhood, to 18th Avenue, to the life he had always lived. He had never sought attention, never wanted fame, never needed recognition. If he was truly retired, he could finally live the quiet life he had always seemed to prefer. If he was still the boss behind the scenes, he could do so from complete invisibility, the puppet master with no strings visible to anyone watching. And for a while, it seemed like the transition was working perfectly. The Gambino family continued to operate smoothly. There were no major disruptions, no power struggles, no internal conflicts. Frank Kali was apparently handling the leadership role effectively. Whether he was the real boss or just Cefalu's representative, the plan seemed to be working. The Sicilian faction had secured control of the family. The old ways had been restored. The ghost had either successfully retired or had achieved perfect invisibility. And then, on a quiet evening in March 2019, everything changed in the most shocking and unexpected way possible. March 13th, 2019, Staten Island, New York. It was just after 9 o'clock p.m. On a Wednesday evening, Frank Kali was at home with his family in the Todd Hill neighborhood, an upscale area where he lived in a brick house that blended in with the other upper-middle-class homes around it. Kali had maintained the low profile that Cefalu had established as standard for the family. He lived modestly by mob boss standards. He didn't flaunt his wealth. He stayed out of the tabloids. He was careful, cautious, living by the code of invisibility that had kept the Gambino family relatively safe for nearly a decade. On this particular evening, Kali was home with his family. Outside, in a blue pickup truck, a young man named Anthony Camello waited. Camello was 24 years old, and he was about to commit the most shocking mob hit in over 3 decades. At approximately 9:17 p.m., Camello backed his truck into Kali's parked Cadillac SUV. The sound of the collision brought Kali out of his house to investigate the damage. He approached the truck, probably expecting a normal conversation with someone who had accidentally hit his vehicle. Instead, Anthony Camello pulled out a 9mm handgun and opened fire. He shot Frank Kali multiple times as Kali stood near the truck. When Kali fell to the ground, Camello walked over and fired more shots into him at close range. Then he ran Kali over with his truck before fleeing the scene. The entire assassination happened in front of Kali's home. With his family inside, Kali was 53 years old. He was pronounced dead at the scene, having been shot at least 6 times in the torso. The news exploded across New York and throughout the underworld. Frank Kali, the acting boss or possibly the official boss of the Gambino crime family, had been murdered outside his home in a brazen hit that immediately drew comparisons to the 1985 murder of Paul Castellano. In fact, this was the first assassination of a New York Mafia boss since Castellano's death 34 years earlier. The significance of that was enormous. For over 3 decades, despite all the internal conflicts, all the prosecutions, all the turmoil within the 5 families, there had not been a single successful hit on a sitting boss, and now Suddenly, the head of the Gambino family had been gunned down in his own driveway. The immediate assumption, both in the media and within law enforcement circles, was that this was a mafia hit. Perhaps there was a power struggle within the Gambino family. Perhaps another family was making a move. Perhaps someone felt disrespected or cut out of business opportunities. Perhaps Kali had violated some rule or made some enemy who felt they had no choice but to eliminate him. The theories flew fast and furious. Some suggested that traditional American mobsters within the Gambino family had resented the Sicilian faction's control and had orchestrated a coup. Others proposed that the hit had come from outside the family, perhaps from one of the other 5 families. Still others wondered if Kali's deep connections to the Sicilian Mafia had somehow put him in the crosshairs of an international dispute. The FBI and NYPD launched a massive investigation. They had surveillance video showing the truck and the shooter, but the quality wasn't good enough to immediately identify him. They interviewed witnesses. They reached out to informants within organized crime. They prepared for what might be the beginning of a mob war in New York. But then, as the investigation progressed, a strange and disturbing truth began to emerge. This wasn't a mafia hit at all. It was something far more bizarre, and, in some ways, more troubling. Anthony Comello was not a mobster. He wasn't a member of any crime family. He wasn't a professional hitman. He was, by all accounts, a deeply disturbed young man who had become obsessed with QAnon conspiracy theories and right-wing political rhetoric. He believed that prominent Democrats and Hollywood figures were involved in satanic child abuse rings. He had become increasingly unstable, increasingly paranoid, increasingly disconnected from reality, for reasons that remain unclear and probably made sense only in his deranged mind. Comello had decided that Frank Kali was part of the deep state conspiracy he believed in. He decided that Kali needed to be eliminated. And so, with no connection to organized crime, no understanding of what he was really doing, he murdered a mafia boss. When Comello was arrested a day after the shooting at his home in New Jersey, he appeared in court with QAnon slogans and conspiracy theory references written on his hands. He rambled about President Trump and the deep state. It became clear that he was not connected to any criminal organization. He was simply mentally ill, radicalized by online conspiracy theories, and homicidal. The mafia community, both the criminals and the law enforcement officials who tracked them, were stunned. This was unprecedented. Mob bosses didn't get killed by random civilians. They got killed by other mobsters for specific reasons related to power, money, or violations of the code. A mob hit was a calculated act with strategic purposes. It sent messages. It redistributed power. It had meaning within the context of organized crime, but this was senseless, random, a case of a mentally unstable person who had consumed too much online propaganda and decided to act on his delusions. Frank Kali hadn't been killed because of some mafia conflict. He had been killed because some kid thought he was part of a satanic conspiracy. For the Gambino family, this was devastating on multiple levels. They had lost their public leader, their acting boss, the man who was supposed to carry forward the vision that Domenico Cefalù had established. More than that, they had lost him not in some honorable mafia conflict, not in a battle with law enforcement, but in a completely random act by someone who didn't even understand what the mafia was. There was no one to retaliate against, no rival family to go to war with, no internal traitor to punish. Just a crazy kid who was now in custody, who would be prosecuted for murder, who would spend the rest of his life in prison. The whole thing was pointless, meaningless, absurd, and it left the Gambino family with a massive leadership void. Who would replace Kali? Would Cefalu, now 72 years old, have to come back and resume active leadership? Or had he already been the real boss all along, with Kali merely serving as his public representative? In the aftermath of Frank Kali's murder, the Gambino family faced a critical question. Who was actually in charge? If Kali had truly been the boss, then there was a vacant throne that needed to be filled. If he had been acting boss with Cefalu still holding ultimate authority, then the family needed a new acting boss. Either way, someone had to step into the leadership void. The uncertainty was compounded by the fact that, true to Gambino tradition, under Cefalu's influence, nobody was talking. There were no press releases, no public statements, no clear signals about what was happening at the top of the organization. The family was doing what it did best, operating in complete secrecy. Law enforcement sources began reporting that Lorenzo Mannino had emerged as the new acting boss, or street boss of the family. Mannino was an experienced mobster, a veteran of the organization, who was in his 60s and had the respect of the family's membership. Like Cefalu and Kali before him, he was committed to the old ways, to operating quietly and avoiding attention. But was Mannino the real boss? Or was he just another layer in the protective structure that Cefalu had built? Was Domenico Cefalù, now 72 years old and supposedly retired, still pulling the strings from complete invisibility? The FBI's official position seemed to vary depending on which report you looked at. Some documents listed Mannino as the acting boss. Others continued to list Cefalu as the official boss of the family. This ambiguity was probably exactly what the family wanted. If law enforcement didn't know who was really in charge, they couldn't effectively target the leadership. For Domenico Cefalù, if he was indeed still in control, this situation was actually ideal. He had always operated best in complete invisibility, with Mannino as the public face of leadership, drawing whatever attention came, though Mannino was also very low profile. Cefalu could make strategic decisions without ever being exposed to surveillance or prosecution. Think about the genius of this structure. If you're a federal prosecutor trying to build a RICO case against the Gambino family, you need to prove that specific people committed specific crimes on behalf of the organization. But if you can't even figure out who the real boss is, how do you build your case? Do you indict Mannino, who might just be following orders from someone else? Do you go after Cefalu, who hasn't been seen or connected to any crimes in years? The ambiguity itself becomes a defense. It creates reasonable doubt. It makes prosecution exponentially more difficult. And so, from 2019 to the present day, the leadership structure of the Gambino family has remained one of organized crime's greatest mysteries. Multiple theories exist. Theory 1. Lorenzo Mannino is the actual boss. Having been elevated after Kali's death, with Cefalu fully retired. Theory 2. Cefalu remained the official boss all along, with Kali and now Mannino serving as his representatives and buffers. Theory 3. There's a ruling panel or committee making decisions collectively with no single boss, similar to how other families have operated during crisis periods. Theory 4. Cefalu is the boss in name, maintaining ultimate authority over major decisions, while Mannino handles day-to-day operations as acting boss or street boss. The truth is, we don't know, and that's exactly the point. In an era of constant surveillance, of cell phone tracking, of sophisticated FBI operations, of cooperating witnesses everywhere, the Gambino family, under Domenico Cefalu's influence, has achieved something remarkable. They've made their leadership structure completely unclear to outsiders. What we do know is that the Gambino family continues to exist and operate, Despite decades of prosecutions, despite the decimation of other crime families, despite the cooperation era and the FBI's relentless pressure, the Gambinos remain one of the 5 families. They remain active in their traditional rackets. They remain a power in New York's underworld. And somewhere in Brooklyn, on 18th Avenue or nearby, there's a 77 or 78-year-old man who may or may not be the boss of this entire organization. A man who has never given an interview. A man who has no social media presence. A man who appears in almost no photographs. A man who has spent his entire adult life perfecting the art of invisibility. A ghost who may still rule an empire today, as of 2025. Domenico Cefalù is 78 years old, and he remains one of organized crime's greatest enigmas. We don't know for certain where he lives, though it's assumed he's still in Brooklyn, probably near 18th Avenue, where he has spent most of his American life. We don't know what his daily routine looks like. We don't know if he's still active in the family's operations, or if he's truly retired. We don't know if he has a wife, children, grandchildren. We don't know what he does for leisure, what he thinks about, how he spends his time. This absence of information is not accidental. It's the result of a lifetime spent avoiding attention, avoiding documentation, avoiding any kind of public presence. Domenico Cefalù has achieved something that almost no other modern mob boss has achieved. He has remained almost entirely invisible. Consider what we know about almost every other significant mafia figure in modern history. John Gotti. Endless photographs, videos, interviews, news coverage. Carlo Gambino, photographed at his home, at events, in surveillance photos. Paul Castellano, well-documented life, detailed news coverage. Even other bosses who tried to stay low profile ended up with substantial documentation of their lives and activities. But Cefalu? There are perhaps a handful of known photographs. Almost no video footage, no interviews, no detailed biographical information. No tell-all books by former associates. Nothing. It's as if he understood from his earliest days in the life that the secret to survival was to leave no trace, to create no documentation, to give law enforcement and the public nothing to work with. And it's worked. Since his release from prison in 2009, after his Operation Old Bridge conviction, Domenico Cefalù has not been arrested. He hasn't been indicted. He hasn't been named in any major prosecutions. As far as public records show, he's been a law-abiding citizen for over 15 years. Of course, if he is still the boss of the Gambino family, or even if he's retired, but maintaining connections, he's absolutely not a law-abiding citizen. But proving it would be nearly impossible. He would never discuss business on a phone. He would never use email or text messages for anything sensitive. He would meet people in person in locations that change constantly, taking routes designed to avoid surveillance. He would use intermediaries and buffers to isolate himself from direct connection to crimes. In other words, he would operate exactly the way a Sicilian mafioso has operated for centuries, in complete secrecy, leaving no evidence, trusting no one outside the circle of absolute loyalty. The Gambino family, whether under Cefalu's continued leadership or under the leadership of Lorenzo, Manino, or someone else following Cefalu's blueprint, has remained remarkably stable. There have been no major internal conflicts, no public power struggles, no waves of cooperators from the family's upper ranks. The Sicilian approach, emphasizing loyalty, omerta, discipline, and invisibility, seems to have protected the family from the worst of the law enforcement pressure that has devastated other organizations. This doesn't mean the family is as powerful as it once was, the glory days of La Cosa Nostra. When the five families controlled huge portions of New York's economy, are long gone, modern organized crime operates on a much smaller scale, has less influence, generates less revenue. The FBI and NYPD have become incredibly sophisticated at penetrating and disrupting criminal organizations. RICO statutes allow for the prosecution of entire enterprises. The cooperation era has made trust a scarce resource. But the Gambinos, under the model established by Cefalu, have survived. They have adapted. They have found ways to operate profitably in an environment that has destroyed many other criminal organizations. And they've done it by going back to the basics, to the old Sicilian ways, to the methods that sustained Cosa Nostra for over a century. If Domenico Cefalù is indeed still alive and free, and there's no public information suggesting otherwise, then he has accomplished something truly remarkable. He rose from being a Sicilian immigrant to becoming the boss of one of America's most powerful crime families. He served multiple prison sentences without ever cooperating. He ruled the family for at least 4 years, possibly much longer, without being indicted. And now, in his late 70s, he has either retired peacefully or continues to rule from the shadows. Untouchable, invisible, successful by every measure that matters in his world. He is the anti-Gotti. He is the ghost. He is proof that in the modern era, invisibility isn't just a strategy. It's the only strategy that works. To truly understand Domenico Cefalù and what made him different from almost every other modern American mob boss, you have to understand the Sicilian code that shaped him. This wasn't just about Omerta, though that was central. It was about an entire worldview, a complete philosophy of how to live, how to conduct business, how to wield power. Omerta is often translated simply as code of silence, but that doesn't capture its full meaning. The word comes from the Sicilian word omu, meaning man, and carries connotations of manliness, honor, and self-reliance. Omerta meant that a real man handled his own problems. He didn't run to authorities. He didn't cooperate with outsiders. He didn't betray his own people under any circumstances. In Sicily, where the government was often seen as corrupt, ineffective, or outright hostile to the common people, Omerta made sense as a survival strategy. You couldn't trust the police. They might be in the pocket of your enemies, or they might not care about your problems, or they might use any information you gave them against you. So you relied on your own people, your own family, your own networks of mutual obligation and respect. This wasn't just a criminal code. It was a social code that pervaded Sicilian culture. Peasants lived by it, businessmen lived by it, politicians lived by it, and the Mafia, Cosa Nostra, simply formalized and enforced what was already a deeply embedded cultural value. When Sicilian immigrants came to America, particularly those who came from Mafia backgrounds or who joined La Cosa Nostra in the United States, they brought this code with them, but over generations, it weakened. Second-generation Italian Americans were American in their attitudes, their expectations, their understanding of the world. They had grown up with American values, individualism, rights, legal protections. When they faced decades in prison, the old code didn't always seem worth it. The result was that, by the 1980s and 1990s, cooperators were becoming more common. Sammy Gravano was just the most famous example. Many others, including made men who had taken the oath, decided that cooperation was better than life in prison. The code was breaking down, but not for the Sicilian faction, not for men like Domenico Cefalù, for Cefalu and others like him. Omerta wasn't just a rule, it was an identity. Violating it wasn't just breaking a regulation, that might result in punishment. It was becoming something less than a man, betraying everything that gave your life meaning and structure. It was spiritual death, even before the physical death that would inevitably follow when your former colleagues found you. This explains why Cefalu could serve years in prison for contempt of court without wavering. He wasn't making a calculation about whether cooperation might reduce his sentence. He wasn't weighing the costs and benefits. The option of cooperation simply didn't exist in his mental world. It was literally unthinkable, beyond omerta. Sicilian mafia culture emphasized several other values that shaped Cefalu's approach to leadership. Respect through actions, not words, in Sicilian culture. Talking about yourself, boasting, seeking attention. These were seen as signs of weakness and insecurity. A real man of honor didn't need to tell people how powerful he was. His actions demonstrated it. His reputation spoke for itself. This was the complete opposite of John Gotti's approach and explains why Cefalu operated with such invisibility. Family and blood loyalty above all. Sicilians placed enormous emphasis on family connections. Notice that Cefalu was arrested with his uncle and cousin in 1981. These familial bonds created networks of absolute trust that were essential for criminal enterprises. You could trust family because they were bound to you by blood, not just by business interests. Patience and long-term thinking. Sicilian mafia culture emphasized playing the long game. Don't make impulsive moves. Don't seek immediate gratification. Build power slowly, carefully, with attention to maintaining your position for the long term. This was very different from American criminal culture, which often emphasized getting rich quick and living large in the present. Violence as a tool, not a statement, for Sicilians. Violence was something you used when necessary, efficiently, and without emotion. You didn't kill people to make a point or send a message. You killed them to solve a specific problem. And you did it quietly, without fanfare. The concept of lupara bianca, making someone disappear completely, reflected this approach. Connections to the old country. Cefalu and other Sicilian mobsters maintained strong ties to mafia families in Sicily. These connections were valuable for business. The heroin trade depended on them, but also for maintaining cultural continuity, visiting Sicily, maintaining relationships there, marrying Sicilian women, staying connected to the traditions. All of this reinforced the values and kept the American Sicilians from becoming too Americanized. All of these values made the Sicilian faction within the Gambino family more stable, more reliable, more resistant to law enforcement pressure than the American-born faction. And it's why, when the family needed a leader who could navigate the treacherous waters of 21st century organized crime, they turned to a Sicilian who embodied all of these values. Domenico Cefalù wasn't just a boss. He was a representative of a way of life, a cultural tradition, a code that had sustained La Cosa Nostra for over a century. And by returning the Gambino family to these roots, he gave them their best chance of survival in an incredibly hostile environment. The contrast between John Gotti and Domenico Cefalù could not be more stark. In many ways, understanding this contrast is the key to understanding why Cefalu succeeded where Gotti failed, why Cefalu remained free while Gotti died in prison, why Cefalu's approach to leadership represented the future of organized crime, while Gotti's approach represented a dead end. John Gotti was charismatic, flamboyant, larger than life. He wore expensive suits, handmade, perfectly tailored, sometimes costing thousands of dollars. He styled his hair meticulously. He held court at the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street, where crowds of admirers and curiosity seekers would gather to catch a glimpse of him He was photographed constantly. He appeared on magazine covers. He was, for a time, arguably the most famous criminal in America. Gotti loved the attention. He craved it. Being a mob boss wasn't just about power and money for him. It was about status, recognition, being somebody. He wanted to be seen, to be known, to be respected not just by other criminals, but by the general public. He wanted to be a celebrity gangster in the tradition of Al Capone. And for a while, it worked. His expensive lawyers beat 3 major prosecutions in the late 1980s. The acquittals made him seem invincible. The media ate it up. He was the Teflon Don. Nothing stuck to him. He seemed to have outsmarted the entire federal government. But it was all an illusion. The attention that Gotti courted was the same thing that destroyed him. Every time he appeared in public, the FBI photographed him. Every meeting he held at the Ravenite was surveilled. Every public statement he made was analyzed. The more visible he became, the more resources the FBI dedicated to bringing him down. And eventually, they got him. The bugs in the Ravenite captured him on tape discussing murders and criminal enterprises. Sammy Gravano, partly motivated by listening to Gotti criticize him on these tapes, decided to cooperate. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence. And despite Gotti's charisma and his expensive lawyers, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. He spent the last decade of his life in the federal Supermax prison in Marion, Illinois, in virtual isolation, dying slowly of throat cancer. He requested to be released to spend his final months with his family. The request was denied. He died in prison in 2002, probably the most famous mob boss of the modern era, but also one of the most tragic examples of how seeking fame can destroy you. Now, contrast that with Domenico Cefalù. Cefalu wore modest clothes, nothing flashy, nothing memorable. The kind of clothes a retired working-class guy in Brooklyn might wear. He didn't hang out in social clubs where the FBI could surveil him. He didn't give interviews. He didn't pose for photographs. He didn't hold court in public places. He moved through the world like a ghost, visible only when absolutely necessary, and forgettable even then. Where Gotti sought fame, Cefalu sought invisibility. Where Gotti wanted to be seen, Cefalu wanted to disappear. Where Gotti saw being a mob boss as a form of celebrity, Cefalu saw it as a responsibility to be handled with discretion and intelligence. The results speak for themselves. Gotti's tenure as boss lasted from 1985 to 1992. Just 7 years before he was convicted and imprisoned for life. Cefalu's tenure as official boss lasted from 2011 to at least 2015, possibly to the present day, over a decade without any indictments or serious legal troubles. Gotti's approach brought enormous law enforcement scrutiny to the Gambino family, resulting in dozens of prosecutions, numerous cooperators, and the near destruction of the organization. Cefalu's approach brought stability, a reduction in law enforcement pressure, and the survival of the family as a viable criminal enterprise. Gotti's legacy is complicated. He's remembered as charismatic but reckless, as a celebrity who forgot that criminals are supposed to avoid attention. Cefalu's legacy, whatever it ultimately turns out to be, will be of a traditional mafioso who understood that real power comes from invisibility. There's a broader lesson here about leadership in criminal organizations, but really about leadership in any context where visibility creates vulnerability. Gotti represents a certain type of leader, a charismatic showman who leads from the front, who wants credit and recognition, who measures success partly by how famous they become. This type of leader can be effective in certain contexts, but in any situation where anonymity is protective, They're dangerous to themselves and their organization. Cefalu represents a different type, the invisible leader who influences from the shadows, who doesn't need credit, who measures success by survival and stability rather than fame. In the modern world of organized crime, where the FBI has nearly unlimited resources and sophisticated technology, this is the only type of leadership that works. Carlo Gambino, who ruled the family from 1957 to 1976, nearly 20 years, understood this. He was quiet, modest, avoided the limelight. He died a free man of natural causes. Having never spent significant time in prison during his reign as boss, Cefalu understood this too. He learned from the Sicilian tradition and from the successful American bosses who had thrived by being invisible. Gotti didn't understand it, or didn't care, or believed his charisma and luck would protect him. They didn't. And his failure serves as a cautionary tale that Cefalu would have studied carefully, learning exactly what not to do when leading a major criminal organization in the modern era. The irony is that Gotti is far more famous than Cefalu. Most people interested in organized crime know who John Gotti was. Very few have heard of Domenico Cefalù, but in the world they both operated in. Fame was a liability, and anonymity was an asset. By that measure, Cefalu was far more successful, precisely because so few people know his name. One of the most fascinating aspects of Domenico Cefalu's story is not what we know about him, but what we don't know. After decades of research into organized crime, after countless FBI investigations, after the cooperation era that has exposed the inner workings of mafia families in unprecedented detail, Domenico Cefalù remains largely a mystery. We don't know basic biographical details that would be common knowledge for almost any other mob boss. Is he married? Does he have children? Grandchildren? What does his family life look like? These are questions we can answer about almost every other significant mafia figure in modern history. But not about Cefalu. We don't know what legitimate businesses, if any, he owns or has owned. Does he have a front? A cover story for where his money comes from? Some kind of legitimate income that explains his lifestyle? The FBI must have investigated this, must have tried to track his finances. But there's nothing in public records that tells us anything definitive. We don't know the full extent of his wealth. How much money did he make over his decades in organized crime? Where is it hidden? Does he own properties? Have offshore accounts? Keep cash buried somewhere? These are questions the government would love to answer, both for prosecution purposes and to seize assets, but apparently they can't. We don't know his current status with certainty. Is he really still the boss? Is he retired? Is he in some advisory role? Different law enforcement sources give different answers, which suggests that even they don't really know. This ambiguity is probably deliberate. If law enforcement can't figure out the leadership structure, they can't effectively prosecute it. We don't know how he communicates with the family if he's still involved. Does he have regular meetings? Does he use intermediaries? Does he maintain complete isolation? How does someone run a criminal organization or maintain influence over one in an era of constant surveillance? Whatever his method, it seems to work. We don't know what his relationship is with the Sicilian Mafia today. Those connections were crucial when he was coming up, essential for the heroin trade and other operations. Are they still maintained? Does he have relationships with current Sicilian bosses? Or has that faded as he's gotten older? We don't know his health status. At 77 or 78, health issues would be normal. Is he still mentally sharp, physically capable? Does he have the stamina to still be involved in organizational leadership? Or has age finally caught up with him in ways that have forced him to step back. We don't know what he thinks about the modern state of organized crime. Does he see the Gambino family's current status as a success? They've survived where others have fallen, or as a failure compared to the glory days of the past? Does he have regrets, frustrations, satisfaction with what he's accomplished? We don't know what he thinks about cooperators, about the breakdown of omerta in the American Mafia. Does he see himself as one of the last true men of honor? Does he look at younger generations with disappointment? Or does he understand that the world has changed and adaptation is necessary? We don't know if he fears law enforcement at this stage of his life. Is he confident that he's covered his tracks well enough, that there's no evidence connecting him to crimes? Or does he worry that some cooperator might emerge with information that could lead to a final prosecution? Most significantly, we don't know what his legacy will be in the insular world of La Cosa Nostra. He's undoubtedly legendary, the Sicilian who kept the code, who served years in prison without breaking, who became boss and ruled successfully. But to the wider world, he remains almost unknown. Is this how he wants it? Is his obscurity itself his greatest achievement? This mystery, this absence of concrete, detailed information, is itself proof of how successfully Cefalu has operated. In an age where privacy is increasingly difficult, where electronic records document everything, where investigators have tools that would have seemed like science fiction a few decades ago, he has managed to keep his life almost completely private. Compare this to Gotti, whose life is extensively documented. We have hours of surveillance footage. We have testimony from dozens of people who knew him. We have interviews with family members. We have detailed records of his finances, his businesses, his associates, his daily movements. We know what restaurants he ate at, what suits he wore, what his favorite pastimes were. His life is an open book. Cefalu's life is a closed book. And that's exactly how he wants it. The mystery isn't a failure of research or investigation. It's a success of operational security, of discipline, of living according to a code that prizes privacy and silence above all else. In organized crime history, there are famous bosses and there are successful bosses. And they're not always the same people. The famous bosses, Capone, Gotti, others, make great movie characters. Their stories are dramatic, full of recognizable moments and quotable lines. They capture the public imagination. But the successful bosses are often the ones we know least about. They're the ones who died free, who ruled for decades, who avoided prosecution, who built lasting organizations. They're not as cinematically interesting because they avoided drama, but they were far more effective at the actual job of being a mob boss. Domenico Cefalù falls squarely in the latter category. His story isn't as exciting as Gotti's in some ways. There are no famous shootouts, no celebrity trials, no dramatic moments of betrayal, but as a case study in how to successfully operate in the upper levels of organized crime in the modern era. It's unmatched. The mystery that remains around his life isn't a bug. It's a feature. It's proof that his approach worked, and it's why. Even though most people have never heard of him, he deserves recognition as one of the most successful mob bosses of the past several decades. In the end, the greatest mystery about Domenico Cefalù might be the simplest one. He's been right there in Brooklyn, on 18th Avenue or nearby. For decades, the FBI knows his name, knows his history, probably even knows where he lives. And yet they haven't been able to touch him. That's not luck. That's skill. That's discipline. That's the Sicilian way. So what do we make of Domenico Cefalù? How do we assess his life, his career, his impact on organized crime? In the world of modern organized crime, where bosses typically face one of three fates: death, imprisonment, or cooperation, remaining free into your late 70s is an extraordinary achievement. It's proof of intelligence, discipline, and commitment to the principles that have sustained La Cosa Nostra for over a century. But his success is also about timing and adaptation. Cefalu came along at exactly the right moment, when the Gambino family needed someone who could operate in the shadows, who understood that the old ways of flashy public gangsterism were obsolete. He offered a vision of how to survive in the surveillance age: complete invisibility, absolute discipline, no ego, no need for public recognition. His Sicilian background was crucial. He brought values and methods that had been somewhat diluted in the American Mafia. Omerta as an absolute principle, patience and long-term thinking, violence as a tool rather than a statement, deep familial loyalty, connections to the old country. These traditional values turned out to be perfectly suited for modern survival. The Gambino family, under Cefalu's influence, whether as active boss or as a retired godfather whose philosophy still guides the organization, has demonstrated that adaptation is possible. While other families have been decimated by prosecutions and cooperators, while the Mafia as a whole has declined dramatically from its mid-20th century peak, the Gambinos have maintained a level of stability and functionality that would have seemed impossible during the chaotic Gotti years. This doesn't mean they're as powerful as they once were. The glory days when the five families controlled huge sectors of the New York economy are gone and not coming back. Modern law enforcement is too sophisticated. Legal tools like RICO are too powerful. And the cooperation era has made trust too scarce. Organized crime operates on a smaller scale now, with less influence and lower profit margins. But survival itself is success in this context. And the Gambinos, following the model Cefalu established, have survived when many predicted they would collapse entirely. That's not nothing. There's also something almost admirable about Cefalu's commitment to his code. Even as we recognize that his code was in service of criminal enterprises that caused real harm, he genuinely believed in Omerta, in loyalty, in the Sicilian traditions. He wasn't a psychopath who enjoyed violence or a pure opportunist who used organized crime to get rich. He was a true believer in La Cosa Nostra as a way of life, as an honorable path for men who lived by certain values. That doesn't excuse his crimes or make him a good person, but it does make him an interesting character study, someone who lived according to principles, even when those principles required enormous sacrifice. Years in prison, constant risk, a life lived in shadows, all in service of a code that most people would abandon the moment it became inconvenient. In the end, Domenico Cefalu's greatest achievement might be the simplest. He beat the system. The FBI, with all its resources and technology and legal powers, couldn't break him. Multiple prosecutions, years of surveillance, the cooperation of numerous witnesses. None of it was enough to destroy him. He understood what many criminal defendants don't, that silence is power, that invisibility is protection, that patience and discipline beat flashiness and ego every time. His story is also a reminder that organized crime is ultimately about people, not just organizations. The Gambino family is a structure, a hierarchy, a set of rules and traditions. But its success or failure depends on the specific human beings who lead it at any given time. Under Gotti, the family nearly destroyed itself through recklessness and ego. Under Cefalu, it stabilized and survived by returning to traditional values and methods. What happens next is uncertain. If Cefalu is still involved, How much longer can he maintain influence? If he's truly retired, has his philosophy been successfully passed on to the next generation? Will Lorenzo Mannino, or whoever leads the family in the coming years, maintain the discipline and invisibility that Cefalu modeled? Or will the family gradually drift back toward American attitudes and behaviors, making them vulnerable again? We don't know, and in keeping with everything about Domenico Cefalu's story, we probably won't know until long after it's happened. The Gambino family will continue to operate in shadows, their leadership structure unclear to outsiders, their activities hidden behind layers of legitimate businesses and careful operational security. But somewhere in Brooklyn, there may still be an old Sicilian man, now in his late 70s, who knows the truth, who knows who really runs the family, who knows what the future holds, who knows all the secrets that law enforcement has tried for decades to uncover. And if that man is Domenico Cefalù, you can be absolutely certain of one thing: he will never tell, because in the end, that's what made him special. Not violence. Lots of gangsters were violent. Not criminal genius. Lots of criminals were smart. Not even longevity, though that's impressive enough. What made Domenico Cefalù special was this: in an era when almost everyone broke, when cooperators were everywhere, when the code of omerta seemed obsolete, he never wavered. He spent years in prison rather than speak. He lived his entire adult life according to principles that required constant sacrifice. He embodied the Sicilian tradition so completely that he became, for all practical purposes, invisible, a ghost ruling an empire from the shadows. He proved that the old ways could still work, that silence was still power, that invisibility was still protection, that a man committed to traditional values could thrive in the modern world by refusing to compromise those values. In the shadowy corners of Brooklyn's 18th Avenue, there lived a man so quiet, so invisible, that even the FBI struggled to track him. And perhaps, in some way, he still lives there, the ghost who ruled the Gambinos, the Sicilian who never broke, the last true believer in a code that once defined an entire subculture. His story is nearly over, or perhaps it ended years ago without anyone noticing. But his legacy will endure, because in the history of La Cosa Nostra, there will always be a place for the man who proved that in a world of informants and surveillance, of cooperation and publicity, the loudest voice is often the first to fall. But the silent one, he just might rule forever. And that's the complete story of Domenico Cefalù, Italian Dom, the man who ended the Gotti dynasty and brought the ancient Sicilian code back to the streets of New York. A man who chose silence over fame, and because of it has remained free and powerful for over a decade as boss. If you made it all the way through this story, I want to thank you. This kind of deep dive takes hours to research and craft, and your time means everything. If you learned something new, if this story kept you company through the night or through your drive, do me a favor, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow and lets me know you want more stories like this. And if you haven't already subscribed, what are you waiting for? We've got dozens more stories about the most fascinating, mysterious, and dangerous figures in organized crime history. From the five families to the Sicilian Mafia to gangsters you've never heard of. They're all here waiting for you. Drop a comment and let me know. What do you think happened to Domenico Cefalù? Is he still calling the shots from the shadows, or did he finally retire to a quiet life in Brooklyn? And what gangster should I cover next? I read every comment, and many of my videos come from your suggestions. Before you drift off to sleep or move on to your next video, share this with someone who loves true crime, mafia history, or just incredible stories about people who live life on their own terms. Until next time, stay safe out there, and remember, in the world of La Cosa Nostra, the loudest voice is often the first to fall, but the silent one, he just might rule forever. Good night.